Hey everyone, my name is Pacifico. I've been putting off putting out this video for a while, and I feel like I just need to do it. Um, and it's primarily aimed at people who aren't taking this COVID-19 thing seriously, and for people who aren't connecting it with a lot of stuff that's going on in the United States and a lot of stuff that's been going on in the United States for a while. A couple years back, one of my friends told me that she thought one of my strengths was my ability to see a lot of different things and connect the dots between a variety of different pieces of information, stuff in theology and psychology and politics, and weave it all together into a whole. And I think she was right. And everything that I've been paying attention to for the last several years makes me just absolutely terrified of what's going on right now and very fearful for the next couple months, if not years, about the status quo in the United States. So this video is really just me trying to connect the dots for people who aren't connecting them yet. And hopefully, there's a lot of people who are taking this seriously, but even they might be hyper focused on the short-term things. Where am I going to get my April rent? Am I going to get sick or not? And it's important to think about that stuff, and I'm scared about that too. But there's also a lot of other things that are connecting with this. So without further ado, just in terms of COVID-19, I wrote down some notes. This is a novel virus. Symptoms show up between 2 and 14 days. There's asymptomatic carriers, right? People can never have the disease or never have symptoms and still spread the disease. So that makes it pretty scary. Primary symptoms include a fever, cough, and shortness of breath, according to the CDC. And it can be fatal. And the primary way that it gets fatal is that it leads to an infection. When the infection gets down to your lungs, it can shut down your respiratory system, right? Which is why respirators are a big thing in everyone's mind right now. The CDC estimates of the case fatality rate, meaning the percentage of people who get sick with this and die from it, is anywhere from 0.25 to 3%, right? It's a pretty big range. For comparison, the swine flu, H1N1 pandemic of April 2009 to 2010, there was 60 million cases, about 250,000 hospitalizations, about 12,000 deaths, and a case fatality rate of 0.02, right? So the lowest estimate for case fatality rate for COVID is over 10 times as lethal as swine flu was. So this isn't just another flu. This isn't just, I think I too have kind of grown callous to, we hear about Zika and swine flu and MERS and SARS, and then it comes and it goes away. We're supposed to be scared and then nothing happens. This is just a different animal. So in terms of how long it's going to last, right, and how widespread it's going to be, CDC is estimating between 160 million and 214 million people are going to get this. Potentially, if there's no intervention, they're talking about 2.4 million to 21 million people dying here in the United States, right? Let me back that up. As many as 200,000 to 1.7 million could die, right? 2.4 million to 21 million people in the US will require hospitalization, and a leaked CDC COVID-19 response plan is assuming that this is going to last at least 18 months, and it's going to involve multiple waves of infection, right? So this is not going to be 2 or 3 weeks. This is going to be a long-term pandemic, right? So next, we want to think about how effective our response will be, right? Because, we want to address COVID-19. We're not just going to let it run through our country, right? But COVID-19, that same document assumes that COVID-19 will overwhelm local hospitals and states will ask for federal help. They add that supply chains will be disrupted and there will be shortages for government, business, and individual consumers, right? And that's shortages in medical stuff, that's shortages in food, shortages in water, whatever. The government response overall is going to be slowed in part by the virus, right? The government has to abide by social distancing. The government has to send people to work from home, right? So that's going to slow down the government's response. So government itself is not assuming it's going to operate best in this crisis. So it's not exactly instilling confidence, right? So already individual states are implementing various measures, stay-home orders, social distancing stuff, maybe some quarantine, right? Some light quarantine, maybe I'll call it, right? But it's really uneven, right? So how effective are these measures going to be, right? Well, We might look at China, right? So China's first case happened on December 31st. By January 23, millions of people in Wuhan and Hubei were under a government-enforced quarantine that impacted millions of people. And this was a drastic measure that impacted a lot of people, and it was framed by the Western media as like draconian, authoritarian, right? I think the Times just had an article on the 13th that referred to it as draconian lockdown, right? And I bring that up because in Western countries, we're a lot more independent. We're not a collectivist culture. We don't like strong central leadership. Like there's a bent to us that's just like anti-government, anti-authoritarian, and really independent. So chances of something like that happening here are low, right? But with those intense measures, right, China is just starting to ease the lockdown in Wuhan, just starting to see like the end of their curve of infections, right? So it seemed to be effective, but it was about 3 months, right, of a lockdown to be effective. As of 3/23/20, right, when I wrote this, China had reported 3,270 deaths from COVID and roughly 56 cases of COVID per 1 million people in their country. Italy, by contrast, had already surpassed their death toll with over 6,000 deaths and reported 1,057 cases per 100 million people. So tons more people got this per capita in Italy compared to China. The United States has seen roughly 454 deaths, and we've already reported 131 cases per 1 million people in the country, meaning we have just under triple like the cases per population that China had, right? So this is not looking good in terms of how effective our response is going to be. All right. But it gets worse, right? That's probably the theme of this video, right? It's always going to get worse, right? Our healthcare system is woefully unprepared for this pandemic, right? In the United States, our healthcare system is one of the most expensive, least accessible, and least effective healthcare systems in the developed world. A lot of the places that are handling COVID-19 well, we're talking, or even not well, Italy, South Korea, right? There's universal healthcare, there's universal access to healthcare, right? There's a greater number of doctors, hospital beds available, accessible to people. A lot of people in America are on their own. There's 25 million roughly people who are uninsured, and roughly twice as many people that are underinsured. So we got 75 million people who don't access healthcare regularly, right? A lot of people don't receive care because of how expensive it is, and this undermines our physical health as a nation as a whole. So like as a population, we're probably more sickly on average than some other people, right? Because our healthcare is tied to work, right, which is another thing. Millions of people in America are going to be losing their healthcare right now. So they're going to be losing their income, and they're going to be losing their healthcare right in the middle of a pandemic. That doesn't exactly add up to a swift recovery, right? We're going to have millions more American than usual, right? Than the 50, 75 million people usually who have to calculate, okay, do I go get this care and get a huge medical bill? Can I afford this? Right? So even millions more people are going to be added to that number. You're going to have a lot of people who get sick with this and they don't go to the hospital, right? They don't get tested. It doesn't get counted. Maybe they die, maybe they live. Either way, it's probably going to keep spreading because of that. And, recently a woman in California who was uninsured was just charged $35,000 for her COVID-19 treatments and screenings and all that. So this isn't a small thing, right? And Americans, because the way our healthcare system is set up, we have to make that calculation. And that's ultimately net result is going to keep this thing spreading, right? So even if people have access to healthcare, even if people have insurance, our infrastructure, like the number of hospitals, the number of beds, the number of doctors is just ill-equipped to handle this, right? According to leaked COVID-19 government plan, right? 2.4 million to 21 million people in the United States could require hospitalization, right? Potentially crushing the nation's medical system, which only has less than 1 million staffed hospital beds, and fewer than 1/10 of those are for people who are critically ill, right? For anyone watching the news, you see images coming out of Spain where people are lying on hospital hallway floors as they're awaiting treatment. That's going to be a reality here real quick, right? We literally don't have enough hospital beds and gowns and doctors and nurses and administrative staff and all that stuff to really handle something like this, right? On top of that, the people running our healthcare system, doctors, nurses, everyone like that, they're going to get sick with this too, right? And that undermines their ability to actually treat people, of course. I'm already seeing news on Twitter where doctors are dying, nurses are dying, they're mourning their colleagues, right? This is already impacting our healthcare system, right? And of course, on top of all of the suck salad with the pandemic, there's people who need regular care, right? There's people who are going to have heart attacks. There's people who's going to have car accidents and stuff like that. And, people who have chronic illnesses, they still need care. And when they go in, they're going to get substandard care because all these resources, time, energy, effort is going to COVID right now. So that could lead to cascading problems, right? You get substandard care for something that was preventable right now, it becomes lethal or much worse in, 6 months, a year, whatever, right? So there's going to be that cascading effect as well, right? But it gets worse, right? The next thing most people are thinking about is the economy, right? COVID-19, this pandemic is going to decimate our economy. And I think this is a point that a lot of people are missing and a lot of people are in denial about, but the American economy was super rough for a lot of people before COVID-19 hit, right? 60% of Americans didn't have $1,000 saved up for an emergency. 80% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. Wages have been stagnant for decades, right? The millennial generation has seen a reversal of fortunes. We're one of the few generations that's not going to increase in wealth compared to our parents' generation, right? Student loan debt is ballooning. Credit card debt was ballooning, right? People were already so broke, they were already putting off buying homes, having kids, weddings, major expenses, buy new cars, right? Not going on vacations, right? Americans were already really feeling a lot of economic misery, right? And that was before, right, COVID-19, right? A lot of our jobs, right, are facing threats from automation and outsourcing. There's a lot more of the gig economy, which is a convenient way for employers like Amazon to not pay people, right? Not pay people living wages, not pay people, healthcare, all that other stuff. Millions of people, right, who are struggling. A lot of those people who don't have $1,000 saved up for an emergency just got laid off, right? So this means people living paycheck to paycheck are going to suddenly have no income, no savings, and probably no health care if they had it, right, as they're facing a pandemic, right? And again, rent, mortgage, credit card payments, student loan debts, they're all piling up, right? They might get paused, right, but they're going to come due eventually, right? So we're going to have a lot of Americans facing homelessness and bankruptcy very quickly, right? Now, even if those bills are paused, right, those bills add up. And if someone weathers this COVID pandemic and gets a job back, now they're facing a month, 2 months of bills that have been piling up, right? What kind of upward mobility are people going to feel is possible in that situation when they're being crushed before this? And then they're, as a nation, right, millions of people are getting set back a month or two of wages, right? Can you lie and pretend to yourself that this is a meritocracy, that this is a fair system, right? So looking at the bigger picture of that, right, thinking about where that money goes, right? If you have a bunch of people who are coming back from this COVID pandemic and, they're not going to be paying money out for anything that's non-essential, they're going to be paying out for rent, food, and their bills, right? So where does that money go? Well, to people who already have money, right? That money goes out of local communities. That money goes to corporations. That money goes to landlords. That money goes to, people who bought our student loan debt, right? These are people who already have a ton of money. This is the kind of money that gets stashed in the Caymans and doesn't pay taxes, right? This is not money that goes into your local community that fuels the local economy, right? This is going to slow the velocity of money. If you don't know what that is, Google it and look into it a little bit. This is going to slow the velocity of money and it's going to erode our tax base, right? Even more so than it already is. Now, you might be saying, hey, I'm not laid off, or my job's durable, I'm able to work from home, right? Well, you might not be immediately impacted this. You might not be a server who is sent home after a bar closed, right, temporarily or for the next couple months. But eventually this will catch up to you as well, right? All those people too broke to buy food right now, too broke to pay rent, they're definitely not going to be able to buy stuff from your Etsy store, right? People facing crushing medical bills are going to put off major expenses, right? So they're not going to buy a home and furnish it, right? So maybe your construction business takes a hit, right? They're not gonna get married and have kids, right? So maybe your daycare business or your wedding photography business, stuff like that, is gonna take a hit, right? This is gonna slow the economy. And economists have been predicting a recession for some time now, saying it's due. It would be a miracle if this whole situation didn't spark a deep recession that's gonna hit everyone, not just people directly impacted by COVID-19, right? So it gets worse, right? Government agencies and social programs that would help us address this pandemic and its impact have been undermined for years, right? So a lot of people I know, some of my conservative friends, are looking at South Korea and saying, oh, we should just do what South Korea did. The problem is South Korea has been doing stuff that we haven't for a while, and that's like investing in infrastructure, right? for decades, the Dems, the GOP, right, really enchanted by this myth of the welfare queen or this fear of big government, right, have sought to outdo each other when it comes to cutting social spending and eliminating government-funded programs and safety nets, right? So Trump's administration is pretty famous for this, but he's undermined the CDC. CDC's faced a hiring freeze under his admin. They had 700 vacancies left unfilled. Trump ordered the National Security Council's Health Security Unit shuttered. The CDC pandemic response team shuttered in 2018, right? Those would be nice things to have right about now, right? Those would be really nice if we had those. But you know what? A lot of people cheered that as saying, oh, he's cutting the fat out of government. Oh, he's being fiscally responsible, all that stuff, right? Now, Trump's habit of nepotism, corruption, and favoring loyalty to him over any sort of qualification has also undermined a response to COVID-19. I mean, he put Jared Kushner in charge of this pretty quickly after first putting Pence in charge of it, right? So his son-in-law was running point on this, at least for a while, and I think still now. What's Jared Kushner's qualifications? He married Ivanka, and he was a scummy real estate developer. That's it, right? And because of his proximity and loyalty to Trump, he's some of the highest, has access to some of the highest level powers in this nation, right? That's not exactly going to help us navigate a crisis where we need expertise and we need intelligence and we need people who've been trained in this stuff, right? But he's loyal to Trump, so he's there, right? And I don't want to let the Dems off the hook, right? Clinton's welfare reform efforts in the 1990s did significant damage to the social safety net in this country, right? And it's continued to erode since then, especially under Trump. You know, Trump's administration has stated that they're still in the midst of all this going to try to repeal ACA care and replace it, but we all know that's bullshit. They're just going to repeal ACA care. And he's still taking efforts to kick 700,000 people off food stamps, right? So in the midst of this mass unemployment, in the midst of this pandemic, he still wants to kick 1 million people off of food stamps. And I want to remind people that about a fifth of our military is reliant on some sort of government aid, right? This isn't just, you know, this idea that's been implanted in the Republican mindset of this welfare queen, someone just mooching off the system, right? This is our elderly. This is the 1 in 5 children that grow up in poverty. Like, these are worthwhile human beings, right? There is some corruption in the whole system, but it's not widespread, and it's often limited to mid-level people actually within the system, not individual recipients. The average stay on social assistance is less than 1.5 years, right? This is not this idea that there's this permanent government, a dependency that's created from a culture in America or something like that that's highly racialized. It's just not true. So for most of my adult life, right, 9/11 happened my senior year in high school, right? We have been spending trillions of dollars to wage war against the poorest people on this planet, the vast majority of whom had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. And at the same time, we have been defunding social programs in the United States to balance the budget, right? So this has been going on for years. This has been a bipartisan thing, right? And then on top of that, right, all the physical and mental health issues plaguing our nation that were there before COVID-19 are still there, right? So the deaths of despair, suicides, deaths by overdose, right? Those have been increasing so greatly, especially under the opioid epidemic, that it's lowered our life expectancy for the last several years. It's been declining in America, right? That didn't stop with this pandemic. That's still there, right? So again, there's all this need that needs to be addressed. And administration after administration is eroding social programs and social support for whatever reason, right? And I just want to say on a personal note, this trend has impacted my home community. I'm originally from Central California, which has been referred to as the Appalachia of the West because there's so much poverty and misery there and economic immiseration. It's just horrible, right? And in many ways, some of our health indicators are actually worse than the Appalachia region, which is an infamously poor area of the United States already. And in the mid-2000s, right, a lot of our hospitals and local health places were getting hit with budget cuts. And then 2008 collapse hit, and we were devastated. We hovered around 20% unemployment for a really long time. A lot of people who needed services didn't get services, and there was a meth epidemic in my community that wiped out a lot of people. And this was years before the opioid epidemic hit the nation. And I really fear that what I saw play out in my hometown is part of what we're going to see in America on a national scale, right? Defunded social programs, a major crisis hits, everyone's screwed. And there's just a lot of misery that come with that. But anyway, back to it. So it gets worse, right? We are going into this crisis, an incredibly divided nation, right? In a healthy society, we would band together and face this challenge as one, right? As a people, right? As Americans. We've done it in the past, right? Different sorts of crises, for better or for worse, right? But I really don't think that's going to happen this time. And we live in a climate right now of the worst political polarization anyone reading this or hearing this has lived to experience, right? This has been increasing since the 2000s at the latest, right? And I've been following it, and it's been worrying me ever since. And I think anyone who watching this video probably knows what I'm talking about. But look up Pew Research political polarization, right? Look at their reports on that. You'll see kind of what I'm talking about here. Both sides, right and left politically in this nation, increasingly express attitudes of disgust and fear towards the other party and see them as a threat to the nation's well-being. Support for states seceding from the United States is record highs in a lot of places, right? Social bonds, right? Social cohesion, knowing our neighbors, feeling like a community, that's been eroding for a long time. If you want to look more into that, read Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, right? Or just a primer on it, right? The idea that we are going to come together as a community and address this thing in a unified manner, I just think is unrealistic, right? On a related note, right? There's division in our media, right? And it's eroding our ability to unify as a nation, right? Maybe since the 1990s, maybe we could blame Fox News, who started with the intention of only catering to one segment of the public, right? And then that kind of spiraled out from there. But our news is really partisan, right? There's news for this kind of community, and there's news for this kind of community. And the problem with that is they all have agendas, they're all trying to make money, and you have right and left-leaning people consuming different news sources, right? And distrust in the other people's news sources has also increased, especially on conservatives. Again, look at Pew Research stuff on this. I think it's 68% of Republicans doubt the veracity of CNN, right? A lot of them think journalists have no ethics, right? And that pretty much doubled under Trump, right? I'm sure that had nothing to do with his fake news rhetoric, right? No, it had everything to do with that stuff. So you have two political halves of America that are very distant, that see each other as threats to the nation's well-being. They're consuming their own media, right? And it just increases that partisanship. But then, this divide is not even just with mainstream media anymore. It's also on YouTube, right? On one hand, on the right, you have what's known as the Alternate Influence Network. And Google that. There's a report out on it. And it's basically this idea that there's this whole ecosystem of right-leaning YouTubes that run the spectrum from pretty mild to neo-Nazis. And the problem is with YouTube's algorithm and how people platform each other on each other's shows, you can start out watching Joe Rogan, and 3 days later, your YouTube suggested things will be people denying the Holocaust and advocating for race science and eugenics, right? And so there's that whole, right? In the new media, right? In YouTube and digital media and stuff like that, there's right-leaning people. On the left, there's also other outlets and BreadTube and this whole other ecosystem for leftists, right? So mainstream media is divided, online new media is divided, right? And that erodes our ability to come together as a nation, right? The net result of all this, people choosing their own media, is we can see the same things, but we interpret them differently based on our worldviews and how the media we consume frames them, right? And I think a very powerful example of this was just news about the virus, right? Trump and Fox News and a lot of other people were saying things like, this is being overblown, Democrats are trying to politicize this isn't a really big deal, everyone should keep working, we've got this under lock and key. And CNN and other people are saying, no, this is very serious, right? And if you were only consuming one of those news sources, how would you understand this pandemic, right? So it erodes we have a nation that's thoroughly divided. And even when we see the same things happening in our society, we can't agree on what's going on, right? How do you unify with someone who doesn't even agree on what problems exist? How do you unify with someone who doesn't agree with how to solve those problems, right? How do you unify with someone who looks at you and sees you as un-American and as, in fact, a threat to the nation's well-being, right? How do you come together with that? So the idea that we're just going to band together I think a lot of people are looking back at 9/11 unity as some high point in America, but let me just remind you that 9/11 unity led to Guantanamo, led to the invasion of Iraq, led to a lot of horrible things that our nation did in the last 10 years. Unity is not always the greatest idea, right? But it gets worse, right? I'm not done yet. This is going to be a little bit longer video. It's an election year. COVID-19 is going to make that really bad. It's going to make 2016 look like a pleasant time in American politics, right? So we're already seeing this to some extent, right? The Democratic Party is still moving forward during an outbreak, right, with its primaries in person, right? And there's conflicting signals. Some people saying stay at home, other people saying go and vote, right? But the DNC is pushing it forward, right? They're not allowing states to do anything different. So, when you have places like Illinois and Florida, where people are being told to avoid large crowds, and the only way to vote in a primary is to stand in a line in a large crowd for a couple hours, right? It's going to undermine the voter turnout, right? And no matter what results are, no matter who wins what, it's going to undermine everyone's faith in the integrity of the process, right? There's going to be accusations all around of saying, oh, you were trying to, suppress the vote by making it go forward, or you're trying to suppress the vote by dragging it on, all these things, right? It's going to make it feel, no matter who wins, no matter what exit polls say, it's going to make it feel inauthentic, right? Can you imagine that happening in November in the general election, right? That's going to be a little more serious, a little more intense, right? So that takes us to the general election, right? Whoever wins, Biden, Sanders, whatever, contested convention, people are talking about Cuomo now. Like, I don't really care. Whoever wins the Democratic primary, they're going to go up against Trump. Trump is going to be in the hot seat in a re-election year, right? This is really bad. This is a really scary situation. So Trump thought he was going to ride into this re-election on a strong stock market, which he was packaging and Fox News was packaging as a good economy. And let me remind you what I said about the economic misery that most Americans are facing right now. But it's a good economy because stocks are good. So he thought he was going to ride into re-election on that. That evaporated, and he's evaporating in front of our eyes, right? The stock market is just tanking, right? Jobs are rough, right? So this is going to undermine, right? Like business as usual, right? Trump also just got the GOP refused to impeach him. So he just basically got a get out of jail free card. He feels empowered to do whatever he wants, right? Whatever you think of Trump, you cannot deny that after he did not get impeached, right? He cleaned house in Washington. He got rid of the people who were whistleblowers. He fired a bunch of people. He installed, again, people who are loyal to him. He's talking about doing loyalty tests for new admin positions, right? Basically, anyone who isn't 100% for Trump and lets Trump do whatever he wants, he got rid of them, right? That's dangerous in and of itself, right? So now you have a guy who's pretty much willing to do anything, who feels like he has carte blanche to do whatever he wants in an election year, facing a crisis, and he's in the hot seat, right? That is not a recipe for good governance and like a stable election. I think, that alone causes a lot of problems, right? And I fully anticipate Trump will use existing cultural and racial tensions to try to get his base excited, get them out to vote, right? This means pitting U.S. citizens against other U.S. citizens, blaming immigrants, blaming minorities, blaming liberals for all the economic, health, and political woes of the nation, right? That's not going to calm things down. That's not going to heal the political division in our land, right? Trump's admin has already implied Europe was exposed to COVID-19 due to allowing Muslim refugees in. Trump is going to do the same thing with Latin American refugees and asylum seekers here, right? There's some people who fear that inaction on our border is going to lead to a major outbreak of COVID-19 at our border concentration camps. I'm a little more cynical. I think Trump is actually planning on that, and he's hoping for it. And the reason I say that is because if there's an outbreak of COVID among Latin American immigrants, Trump can say, aha, see, these immigrants were disease carriers. It's good that I shut them down and kept them away from America. And we can't release them because if we release them, they'll just spread this disease everywhere. Some people might think that's cynical, but, painting refugees and immigrants as disease carriers has a long tradition in the United States. And to think that, and other countries, right? And to think that that's beyond Trump, I think that's just, ridiculous, right? So Trump is going to get more intense. This, political year is going to get more intense. And then whoever wins the election, right? Again, if the pandemic is still going on in November, and there's all kinds of voter issues, or people are voting in a new way for the first time, or if it's everyone voting by mail, it's gonna get tough. You know, it's gonna be weird. I think Trump is gonna come pretty unhinged, right? Because he wants to stay in power, and you know, he really fears a Democratic government after him would impeach him, right? Or excuse me, not impeach him, but charge him with some stuff and hold him accountable, right? But it gets worse, right? I really do think political violence is going to escalate in the coming years. And what I mean by political violence is people killing people over political disputes, right? It's not just going to be online Facebook shit posting. It's going to be some more people dead, right? This is already happening, right? To be clear, right? You have the MAGA bomber, you have the Tree of Life shooter, you have the guy who stabbed three men, killing two for his right to harass Muslim people, right? You have the street fights going on between like Patriot Prayer and Antifa. You have the Democrat guy who went and shot at conservative politicians, right, during a baseball game, right? You already have a lot of politically motivated violence. You have the El Paso shooter, you have Dylan Roof, right? These mass shootings, right? A lot of people talk about guns or guns control. They don't talk about the politics behind it. Those were political acts, right? So this is already happening, right? I think that's going to increase a lot. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming months and maybe years, right? So there's over, one of the reasons I say that is because of the fault lines around guns and gun control, right? There's 300 million firearms in civilian ownership in the United States right now. That's more than every police force and military in the United States combined, right? And these firearms are in the hands of a nation divided, right? It's not a recipe for everything going well. And few issues are as polarizing as guns, but you know, whoever wins the Democratic nomination, like Biden and Sanders right now, both have assault weapons bans on their platforms. I think if they really pursue that, if they win the election, you're going to see a lot of violence around that, right? They are calling for banning 5 to 50 million of the most popular firearms with an assault weapons ban. I mean, Biden recently had that altercation with the gun supporter. He appointed Beto O'Rourke. Beto, hell yes, I'm gonna take your AK-47s and AR-15s, right? As his like gun control czar or whatever, right? So if the Democrats win and they really do pursue that, they follow through on that, I think it's gonna go badly, right? During the election season, Trump is gonna ramp that up a ton, right? Despite the fact that he actually has a worse record on gun control than a lot of Democrats, he is gonna say, if these Democrats come to power, these communists or these socialists are going to take your guns, right? You need to vote for me, right? That's going to excite some of his base. But his rhetoric's not going to stay calm. He's already wink, wink, nudge, nudge, said, hey, maybe the Second Amendment people can take care of that, you know, coyly or not so coyly condoning violence at his rallies and among his supporters, right? You think 2020 is going to be different? It's going to be a lot calmer, especially when these Democrats are calling for an assault weapons ban. Right. I mean, Virginia, and we see a small case study of this, right? Virginia, the state, recently went blue. And one of the Democrats' first actions wasn't fixing healthcare, wasn't fixing wages, wasn't fixing a lot of stuff, was going after guns and banning assault rifles. Even though assault rifle deaths in Virginia are basically non-existent, right? This is a problem that is an optics one. It's not a real issue. And the reaction to these gun control laws was 20,000 Americans, many of whom were armed to the teeth, showing up in Virginia. And the only reason there wasn't violence breaking out in that situation, right, was because the left made a tactical decision not to counter-protest. There wasn't a large enough group of like leftist counter-protesters that could have sparked a conflict, right, with all of these armed right-wing Second Amendment supporters, right? And I know people who went to that rally, right? And they're not going to take a disarmament order or something like that from the federal government lying down, right? They're not going to surrender these weapons, right? And I'm talking about pretty average, middle of the road conservatives, right? No, these people aren't necessarily extremists. They're just not going to obey, right? Some new assault weapons ban or some confiscation, right? And that's just the moderates, right? Let's talk about the extremists, right? All the right-wing extremism in America, all that Charlottesville shit, all those different groups out there that you've heard about or barely paying attention to, they didn't go away because COVID-19 happened, right? In fact, many of them are trying to step up in this moment, right? A lot of the extremists in America really don't like the United States government, want it to collapse, right? One whole stream of them, like the Christian identity kind of current that is really underneath a lot of white supremacist and neo-Nazi stuff in America today. And if you want to learn more about that, read Challenger at the Sidelines, by the way. Their whole vision is to enact a race war, right? So if the government goes down, it allows them to kick off this race war a lot sooner and to basically go out and kill black and brown people and white people who they deem to be race traitors without any interference with government, right? Again, Dylan Roof shooting at the AME church, he was trying to start a race war. That was a political attack, right? The Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, it's just over a year from that event happening. What he wanted to do was increase gun laws in America, right, by committing this egregious mass shooting that would get people, liberals, to call for more gun control, and that would set off a spark and cause chaos and eventually allow for, some mass murder of brown people, right? So these extremists are out there, and they're really actively going to be seeking to push us over the ledge, right? They see a crisis. That's a total opportunity for them. That event in Virginia that drew 20,000 Second Amendment supporters? There was an attack plan there. It wasn't by any leftist organization. It wasn't by Antifa. It was by Atomwaffen, a hard-right neo-Nazi extremist group that's accelerationist, right? They wanted to commit an attack, kill a bunch of conservatives as a false flag attack, right? And they hoped that would, spiral out of control and other people get shot. And some of those people would see it on the news and start fighting each other, like they're actively planning this stuff, right? And then there's another thing that was at the Virginia thing is there's this whole Boogaloo subculture, right? And I don't really have time to get into all the ins and outs of it, but let's just say there's a significant portion of people online, right, cracking a lot of jokes about a second civil war. And the problem with that is there's a lot of people who are just cracking jokes, but there's some people who really want it. At this rally, there are people who showed up on the right-wing side, and they were disappointed that nothing happened, meaning they didn't get an opportunity to shoot leftists, right? That nothing popped off, right? And they said, oh, this just is a rally. This is dumb, right? We need to be killing people, basically. And I know some people who share Boogaloo memes, and I probably cracked a joke about it here or there, but I think it deserves to mention that a recent study of that meme and how it originated in 4chan, there are two words that were highly associated with it. One of them was race war. Kind of speaks for itself. The other one was DOTR, or Day of the Rope. That is a white supremacist fantasy about going around and hanging white people that they deem as race traitors. White people who married people of color, like my mom, white people who stand up for Black Lives Matter, white people who aren't, the right kind of white person or whatever, right? So this Boogaloo subculture, this Boogaloo meme, which is kind of like all over diffuse in America right now, a bunch of people spoiling for a second civil war with this tinge of extreme eliminationist racism is in the air. It's in the water. Right? It's in the Second Amendment community. And again, is that going to calm things down? Is that going to decrease the chance of political violence? I don't think so, right? So kind of to summarize, right, we've got a deadly virus. It's more deadly than some other viruses we've experienced or the world has faced. It's spreading. Our nation is not responding effectively for a variety of reasons. Our health infrastructure is not going to be able to handle it. There were a ton of problems in America before this happened. A lot of people weren't paying attention to them. It was out of sight, out of mind, right? It didn't impact them personally, so whatever, right? Now it's those things are going to come back, right? We're politically divided, right? We have a contentious election year ahead of us. We have a whole subculture of kind of like wanting a second civil war. We have a ton of firearms in American ownership. We have people out there on the right using extremist, eliminationist language, right? Even Trump himself, he put up a poll recently that said, are you an American or are you a socialist, right? That binary, them or us, right? That's pushing us towards, right, a place where Americans would kill other Americans and not feel anything about it, right? So we're in a very, very dangerous time. And I don't think it's outside the possibility, and I personally think we probably will see a civil war in my lifetime. And I think it's sooner, given all this stuff with COVID, than later. That sounds like a dire prediction, right? And even if that doesn't happen, we're going to face shortages, we're going to face a pandemic, we're going to face economic misery, right? It's going to be worse than 2008. So even if I'm wrong about the Civil War thing, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's going to make the next couple months and next year or a couple years suck a lot for most people in America, right? I could be wrong, right? I've been wrong about things in the past, but this blog post, this thing that I wrote up, it stemmed from an article, or a little short blurb that I wrote on Facebook on the 16th of this month, right? And since the 16th of this month, right, that government plan was leaked, right, showing the scope and scale of how long this is probably going to last. Trump already pivoted to start talking about the China virus, right, stoking up racism. Now we have hate crimes against Asian Americans on the rise, right? March 17th, hospital workers started making masks about office supplies, right? These are all news stories that I'm reading. 18th, Vice wrote about how online discussions indicated that right-wing extremists, specifically neo-Nazi accelerationists, were seeking to take advantage of the situation. So they were trying to weaponize COVID-19, trying to find ways to literally spread the disease to law enforcement, minority communities, right? March 19th, Lowley Institute wrote about this in the context of Australia, and they said, this is their quotation, what we have found so far suggests that right-wing extremists have used these disasters to contest government legitimacy, to identify groups to blame, and to encourage mobilization, and in doing so, tacitly incite violence against outsider groups as a response, right? I think that's going to be true here too. March 19th was when that woman was hit with a $35,000 bill for COVID-19, right? March 19th, there's all these stories about price gouging occurring in the healthcare industry, right? Masks that used to cost 50 cents now all of a sudden being upcharged $7, right? March 19th, Goldman Sachs predicts 2 million will apply for unemployment. And for context, 0.7 million applied during the height of 2000-2008 recession. So twice the unemployment application is what Goldman Sachs thinking, right? March 21st, amid hospital shortages, U.S. hospitals are making guidelines for who gets care on COVID-19, meaning there's going to be some people that they're going to choose not to treat. March 24th, economists say the U.S. is facing the worst ever quarterly contraction and is entering a recession, right? Also on 24th, MSN News reported that some countries have started banning exports of food. If this becomes a trend, food nationalism could lead to shortages of specific items in other areas. March 25th, calls to the National Suicide Prevention Hotline have increased over 300%, right? So not everything that I talked about in my post on the 16th or even in this video has happened or has happened yet. Things also have broken a little differently. I didn't foresee Trump going to UBI. At least bailouts, right? But I did see the racism coming, right? I did see the extremism coming. I did see the overwhelming nature of a lot of this stuff, right? So in sum, if you're not taking this seriously, you need to start taking this seriously. This is not the time to advocate to Americans just go back to normal or go back to the status quo, go back to their jobs and continue on as if nothing's happening in our nation. Even if we did that, right? All of these other problems that existed before COVID-19, many of them that maybe you didn't know about, weren't paying attention to, they're there and they're not going away. So I hope this was a downer video. I hope this discouraged some of you. I hope this disabused some of you of maybe some really unrealistic optimism about this whole situation. But I also don't want to leave you feeling like pretty helpless or hopeless in the face of a lot of these problems. So after this video, maybe in a couple days or two, I'm going to do another video about what you can do to help right now and what can be done about a lot of this stuff.